But as journalists, are you doing enough? You know, this is the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced.
Climate activist Phoebe Plummer from Just Stop Oil, best known as one of the girls that threw soup on the Van Gogh painting, which again was not damaged, it was covered in glass. But she was on BBC Newsnight discussing both COP27, which I'll get to more on after the clip, as well as doing a great job pushing back against the media here. So I'm going to show you this clip, and I got a second clip coming up that has to do with her explaining why she did that protest. But first, this clip from BBC Newsnight.
I wish I had hope in the COP conference, but 26 years of COP have shown that they have been hopelessly inadequate. Just Stop Oil's one demand is that the government immediately ends all new fossil fuel licenses. It's a no-brainer demand, yet the government still can't do that.
Phoebe Plummer, do you think you are taking enough people with you when it comes to the kind of direct protest, whether it's blocking roads or spraying paint on a famous painting?
You know, this isn't a popularity contest. We're making change.
But are you bringing people with you?
Are you bringing people with you? Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really grateful to be here and have this discussion. It needs to happen. But as journalists, are you doing enough? You know, this is the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced. You make time to report on the sport every day. Why aren't you telling people how bad it's going to get? Why aren't you out on the streets with us? Because I admire your optimism and I admire you telling people that we have to go towards a renewable future. I agree with you. But quite frankly, it's not happening in policy. So civil resistance is the only chance we have left to get the radical change we need in the timescale we have left. Okay. To ensure that I have a future, to ensure that millions of people in the global south don't keep dying. 33 million people are displaced in Pakistan right now. And governments are still pushing ahead with these fossil fuel licenses. Okay. That is murderous.
Phoebe Plummer, thank you very much for coming on Newsnight.
Thank you so much for having me on.
No response. Now, look, again, I got a second clip coming up, and that has to do with the explanation for the protest that she was involved in, as well as I have an amazing stat here about the COP27 conference, which was discussed there briefly. But look, let me first give credit here to BBC, the only credit I could find to give them here, where they had on two guests that both understand the need to address climate change. Now, be it in different ways. The other guest there is more about incremental change. She's in government, so it's a little different for her. The activist understands the urgency of the situation, but still, this is an improvement over how these discussions used to go with having someone who understands the need to address climate change, and then the other guests just, not caring at all and being for fossil fuels. So this is at least some progress here in terms of how the media is covering this issue. That said, Phoebe Plummer's point here is exactly on point. You have here a media, and it's not just BBC, of course, it's generally mainstream press, that have treated this issue with such kid gloves in terms of how they address fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry. The media's job is supposed to be about speaking truth to power. It's supposed to be about representing the interests of the masses against the powerful and those that control them. But largely, the media has simply been working in tandem and giving excuses for those in power, including fossil fuel companies. So to have this acknowledgement here from Plummer, the activist, for her to acknowledge, or at least raise the issue of how the media should be doing a better job here. Like for the media to focus their criticisms on an activist throwing soup at a painting that wasn't even damaged, as opposed to having a larger criticism of the fossil fuel industry and the subsidies that they still enjoy and the new fossil fuel projects that are being developed. For them to have more anger at the activists opposed to the fossil fuel industry is completely insane and really shows you how the media generally props up those in power and protects those in power and pushes down any criticisms of the status quo. Now, on COP27, so this was the conference that was brought up at the beginning of that discussion there. This is a climate conference that happens every year. This is the 27th one. This is incredible. So this from Common Dreams is headline here, a twisted joke. 636 fossil fuel lobbyists swarm COP27 climate talks. Quote here, tobacco lobbyists wouldn't be welcomed at a health conference, said a corporate watchdog coalition. Those perpetuating the world's fossil fuel addiction should not be allowed through the doors of a climate conference. So this goes to why the COP conference has been such a disaster in terms of trying to or accomplishing any progress at all. When you have fossil fuel lobbyists embedded in the conference, how much progress do you really expect to make? So a little more here from this piece. The COP27 talks in Egypt have been billed as an opportunity for countries to showcase unity against the existential threat of climate change, but an analysis released Thursday shows there are more fossil fuel lobbyists attending the conference than representatives of the 10 nations most affected by the crisis, heightening concerns that industry influence will water down any agreements reached at the event. A data analysis of the United Nations provisional attendance list for the closely watched conference shows that 636 fossil fuel lobbyists have been registered at the talks, up 25% from last year's COP26 conference in Glasgow. So not only are there lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry there, it's getting worse. Again, going to why there is not much progress being made there. Now, let me get to this last clip. This is, this was shot shortly after Phoebe Plummer's protest throwing the soup on the Van Gogh painting. And here she is explaining why she did it.
Trusty soup can, part of my brand now. I would like to make one thing perfectly clear. We did no damage to the painting whatsoever. I was in court yesterday, heard that there's been minimal damage done to the frame, which is repairable and replaceable, and absolutely no damage done to the painting. It was behind glass, and we never ever would have considered doing it if we didn't know that it was behind glass and that we wouldn't do any damage. I mean, literally, we were sat there still glued to the wall. They wiped it off with a bit of kitchen roll. I recognise that it looks like a slightly ridiculous action. I agree, it is ridiculous, but we're not asking the question, should everybody be throwing soup on paintings? What we're doing is getting the conversation going so we can ask the questions that matter. Questions like, is it okay that Liz Truss is licensing over 100 new fossil fuel licenses? Is it okay that fossil fuels are subsidised 30 times more than renewables when offshore wind is currently 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels? Is it okay that it is there in action that has led us to the cost of living crisis? Where this winter people are going to be forced to choose between heating and eating? This is the conversation we need to be having now, because we don't have time to waste. Last year, Sir David King said what we do in the next 3 to 4 years will determine the future of humanity. So we're using these actions to get media attention because we need to get people talking about this now. And we know that civil resistance works. History has shown us that it works. I'm stood here today as a queer woman, and the reason that I'm able to vote, the reason I'm able to go to university, hopefully someday marry the person I love, is because of people who have taken part in civil resistance before me.
I think it is undeniable at this point that her protest was a success. From the discussion that it created, from the fact that she's being invited onto platforms like BBC Newsnight to discuss the issue of the climate crisis. And as she said, history shows us that protests and progress are intertwined. You can't have progress without protests, including ones that make people angry and uncomfortable. Go back in time, look at reports around protests involving gay rights, involving civil rights. People were not happy at the time when those were going on, yet they were integral to the successes that came afterwards. So any criticism you may still have of that protest, which at this point I think is ridiculous, considering, again, the painting was not even damaged, but any protest or any issue you may have with that protest, you should have a lot more anger directed towards the fossil fuel industry and what they are doing to society and what the impact of fossil fuels will continue to do to society going forward. So if you have any anger at all at this activist, which again is ridiculous, you should have a lot more anger directed towards the actual issue, which is the fossil fuel industry.